Awesome. So we are now recording. Hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to see all of your faces and nice to meet you all. For those who I haven't met yet, just really grateful that you're here joining us today. Appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webinar, Introduction to Regenerative Organizations. My name's Alex and I'm on the In Rhythm team, currently based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And, you know, I hope that you're all doing well. I know these are kind of strange times for all of us, but it's really fun to be able to connect in this way with you all around a topic that we're really passionate about at In Rhythm. It's really the core of our work, this idea of regenerative organizations. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a management and design firm that unleashes potential in people, organizations, networks, and communities. And we're super excited to introduce you to our approach to regenerative organizations and our work and our thinking around managing and designing organizations and social systems. If you've been with us on a webinar before, some of this might be familiar to you. If you're completely new to us, you know, really excited to hear your thoughts at the end. We'll save some time for discussion and hope to, you know, hear your reflections and questions and learn from your wisdom as well. And so, you know, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Trey Cates. Trey is the founder of In Rhythm, and he'll share more about his background in a little bit. But first, a couple of just logistical experience things. I'm sure you're all professionals at Zoom right now by this time. But we really want to make this webinar as dynamic and engaging as possible. So we'd love if you could make use of the chat feature. So maybe just to get started, love to hear from all of you. I know we've done some verbal introductions, but maybe just type in the chat where you're calling in from. If you're here representing an organization, you could include that. And maybe if you'd like something that sparked your interest in this topic, just to kind of start weaving some connections. I know there's probably a lot of like-minded folks here, and it'd be cool to, you know, leave this webinar with some more connections than how we began. Of course, we're sharing and recording this webinar afterwards. So if you can't join us for the whole thing, or if you'd like to share this with a friend or a coworker, that will be available to you. And I think that's all I've got logistics wise. So without further ado, Trey, I'll hand it over to you to kick off the webinar and, you know, share your screen so that you can show the slides.
Yes. Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone. Super excited that you are all engaging with us today, and just a gratefulness for your interest in really seeing our world differently. And I have some familiar faces that are here on this webinar, so thank you for your ongoing support. Appreciate how that shows up in the work that we're all collectively doing together. So just a big thank you to everyone. So with that, I will, as Alex said, share my screen, and we will get going. So hold on here. Maybe a thumbs up from somebody that says they can see it. Great, awesome. So we just did this, so thank you for putting your location. As you have noticed, we have a strong contingent of people who continue to be working in this idea of rethinking and reimagining and seeing how we organize ourselves differently across the globe. And we're super excited to continue to support that movement and to recognize, as everybody already knows, but the U.S. needs to continue to embrace this, and that is that we are not the center of the universe. The U.S. continues to create our own tensions and challenges of our ability to regenerate the potential that exists even in our own communities. And so, but thank you for allowing us to share, even though at times we're not much of an example of what regeneration is. There are many other communities and countries around the world that continue to be a shining light to all of us on how we can continue to live into a completely different way of organizing ourselves. So with that, we're going to dive in, probably 30, 35 minutes of information. We'll dive into Q&A. If there's something that you're stimulated along the way and you want to drop a question into the chat window, please do so. Both Alex as well as Jen will they will stop me in my tracks, say, Trey, we got a question, and we'll stop and address the question. So, so with that in mind, I want us to just really begin to orient ourselves around the state of what is. And we really, I think it helps us to know how we are currently doing what we're doing, and I think that enhances potentially what and how we could be doing what we're doing. And we'll be talking about what that new metaphor for organizations would be, kind of our approach to design, and then just the opportunity for discussion. But we're going to start with this. What is the most dominant metaphor used to describe organizations today? Feel free to chat your response or unmute and share with us, what do you think that dominant metaphor is?
Toby says machine or military.
Great. Anybody else?
Slow to change, hierarchy.
Awesome. All those are great. I think, and of course, Toby gets an A in the class for answering it from the get-go. And by the way, she's been a teacher of mine too. So, so Toby, thank you. And that is for sure, you know, the machine paradigm continues to dominate everything that we do when we begin to socialize or organize ourselves. Here on the left-hand side of the screen is just a, you know, you can see this in the economies that we are continuing to design, that we see cogs and wheels and parts as a part of what and how we communicate a design to communities. And then on the right-hand side, business as usual is business as a machine, you know, where teams and departments are cogs. But the challenge in all this is it doesn't stop there. It continues because here's just an example, an excerpt from a class that a student takes, where on the left-hand side, the principle of preserving this investment actually begins to say what a machine design says about people, which is that we're developing a perishable commodity. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think any of us want to be considered a perishable commodity. But unfortunately, an industrialized system, which is really where this machine design comes out of, really embraces this kind of idea. And this is top of the line management schools. Or you can see on the right-hand side, this change management perspective. Change management actually seeing strategies and measures and options, all gears as a part of a design process. And unfortunately, I think it degrades what is about all of us when we begin to embrace that.
Hey, Trey, can I just
Yes.
interrupt? Because I want to put Kate Ingersoll on the spot. Kate's the one who introduced us to this clip around principle number 4. So maybe we could just ask Kate to speak to it for a second, because it's pretty awesome that she's here with us, if I may, Kate.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I think this was a Harvard Business Review article, and it was about the future of talent management. And yeah, I just had to share it because the language of perishable commodity was so horrifying. And the entire article was using kind of the metaphor of something going through a supply chain as like the person. The person is the raw material that you want to exploit and extract things from to further your business objectives.
Thank you, Kate. Wonderful insight. And unfortunately, it's common. I could go through all the major business schools in the United States and outside of the United States and begin to show that that's how we've approached development. And development both as an organization, as individuals, because look at this next slide, 19th century, a textbook, seeing our human body as a machine, our brains as machine, our arms as pulleys, our hearts, our lungs as pumps, right? There is some real challenge to our language around this, but not only that, it actually has influenced dramatically our design. And we have a famous business, we won't have to go into who this is, but you could figure it out. But a famous business consultant says, think of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. So we are continuing to communicate and design in a way that is really coming out of a machine paradigm. And so the question for all of us really becomes this: what are the consequences of treating organizations as machines and humans as parts of a machine? Any just kind of off the cuff, you can throw it into the chat field, but what are the things that really start to show up when this is our primary design?
We've got some things coming through the chat. Machines are predictable. It's about control. Lose the creativity critical to innovation.
Great.
Wasteful.
Yes. I think there's some incredible things that start to happen that as a society we haven't really been attuned to, and we need to begin to pay attention. So be aware of. The first thing is I think it shows up in the environment. This is just an example. When we begin to treat living systems like machines, we see the opportunity to extract, and that extraction is then at the expense of that living system. And so here's just a perfect example of the Living Planet Index, where we see a continued decrease in diversity of species across the entire planet. And I think that's because we see it as a resource to extract from versus an opportunity to nurture. Next is people. We know this. Gallup puts out some incredible stats. Gallup's not the only one that does research on things like this, but when we have only 35% of the population, as we know it in the US, engaged, what does that say about the rest of the people that are actually in roles and doing work? They would go as far as to say that's costing $500 billion a year of lost productivity, right? Because of disengagement. And we see that because of design. We also recognize this isn't just one generation, it's multiple generations that are disengaged, but a new generation coming up, which some of you guys may be a part of, and that is the millennials being the most disengaged group. And what does that mean? It just means that there's higher expectations. Organizations' current design, the way we do what we do, is actually creating at times disengagement. We also know that our economic system is actually designed around creating the conditions that result in inequality. We all recognize that it doesn't serve us as a society to have individuals owning and occupying as much wealth as an entire country. And we know in recent days that equity is starting to show up more and more and more in the public's eyes, in the media's eyes, when it's been an issue for centuries. But we recognize that the color of our skin continues to be the #1 predictor of how we're going to do in the world. And that's shameful as a part of the current design process. So much so, we've got a company that a friend of ours, organization, the Gemini Group, has provided some information of how we have really constructed these equity issues from all the laws that we've designed in the United States that continue to actually create inequity. It wasn't just something that happened, we actually constructed it. And what we've constructed, we believe in full visibility, we can deconstruct. So we do see it as a design issue, and are excited to be able to offer alternatives as a part of this process. So for us, what we really want to recognize first and foremost, that this machine paradigm was an empowering metaphor. Incredible amount of things have happened around the continued use of a machine, right? And that has come through the Renaissance, incredible great thinkers from Newton to others, Descartes, who said, listen, we're going to put this to work in a way that will really create some outcomes. And those outcomes were trying to move away from kind of this typical fate or religious approach. And with that, though, it also began to recognize some of the things that do not serve us in reference to that process. Einstein himself made it very clear that when we talk about complexity, or what he called phenomenological complex issues, when they're too large, that the scientific method fails. And he uses the weather as a perfect example of that. So for us, what we begin to recognize is our approach has had some real challenges. And that approach we see directly coming to understanding the difference between complicated and complex. And the difference between complicated and complex is that there are things that we do in making things that allow us the opportunity to really identify inputs, begin to document a series of steps, and actually have predictable outcomes. And that's the beauty of the industrialized process is if we're going to make something, we can actually follow steps to get that repeatable outcome. But when we talk about complexity, which is social systems and natural systems like our ecological centers around the world, our natural environments, they're not predictable inputs. They're dense interdependencies, nonlinear change, and then we get to a place where it's quickly unpredictable. And with that kind of situation, it then requires a completely different design. This comes from a book by General Stanley McChrystal, who wrote the book Team of Teams. And interestingly, he applied this to the armed forces. So the largest organization in the world has begun to recognize that we've designed most things out of this complicated paradigm when really it's complexity and what can we do to do it differently. So things we make and things we manage. So with that, we began to recognize that when we think about complex or complicated things, that the complicated things that we're talking about are things that we can easily put together, right? So if it's a bag of toys or we're assembling a desk, but when we think about this, it is all about complexity. Now, that's begun to be recognized. We're beginning to see that people are saying, how do we rethink educational systems or think healthcare through this complex adaptive process? But we've got a long ways to go because the majority of our design is rooted in this complicated one, which really says a lot about what we think about people. So we believe this is a big movement. This is a big shift, and a shift in perception that isn't really rooted in kind of technology, the digital or Facebook age. It's actually rooted in complexity. And until our design begins to embrace that, I think we're going to continue to have some real frustration. So for us, we're offering an alternative, and that is life as a metaphor. And you see a lot of, we want to pay homage and honor a lot of the movements that exist out there, from biomimicry to holistic management, to work that's being done in places all over the world that begin to recognize that maybe we could utilize some inspiration from other ways of seeing life, seeing how we're doing and designing things that could inspire our approach. And so, just to make fun a little bit, we're not talking about the circle of life, though that is an image that comes to mind when we think about life. The Hakuna Matata, all things works itself out. And you may have a deep spiritual belief that that's the case, but we're going to be talking a little bit about cycles that began to show up in how we see living systems that we can inform design around. But in particular, we're most intrigued and follow Maturana and Varela, which is from the Santiago school, where they're one of the first researchers to begin to see a systems view of life, see it holistically. They're one of the first people to apply that from a research perspective of studying what is life. And we're talking about this because it's important. If we're going to move from a machine paradigm to a life measured paradigm, then what in the world does that mean? Well, they did this incredible research where they examined all the pathways, both chemical and energetic pathways in a simple life form, kind of bacteria. And they recreated it in a cell. And one of the things that they found that they could not do as they recreated it in the cell is its ability to self-maintain and self-repair, or using our term, self-regenerate. But they defined and began to offer this as a real insight into it. They discovered this defining aspect of life, which they called self-maintenance and self-regeneration, but they coined the term autopoiesis, self-poetry or self-making. And we actually believe that insight gives us a real incredible way to reconsider what we think about organizations or the regenerative organization. One of the things that they discovered through this process was self-regeneration wasn't located in any one place, that it was dependent on all the interconnected relationships, that life itself was holistic or emergent, and that all the aspects of the cell were autopoietic as well. So there were holes within holes as a part of its design. And what's so empowering about that is that those things can be real incredible principles on how we would approach our social systems. And just for a moment, I just want you to think about that. What does that look like when we apply it from a social standpoint? Self-regeneration not included in one place, like command and control, or dependent on all the interconnected relationships versus just the ones that matter, or that life here being this emergent property versus everything we've ever could imagine an organization defined down to the dot or to the crossing of the T. And to know that there is real uniqueness and the ability for this self-regeneration to actually happen at multiple different levels and scales, actually, I think transforms how we see organizations. So what came out of that is this idea that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So we see living as regenerative and regenerative equal to living. So when we began to see it as an organized system capable of maintaining itself, we then begin to say, gosh, we can actually create the design that allows us to maintain and regenerate the potential that we all want. So with that, when we think about this in review, the machine paradigm is incredible at doing a couple of things. It engineers best practices. As we all know, best practices is what and how we replicate things. And those best practices results in enforcing this deep prescription. And that deep prescription, when we apply it to a living system, we believe degenerates the health of the system. Now, when we're talking about making things, of course we want to engineer things, and we want best practices, and we want prescriptive structures, because the beauty of a machine is that it can replicate itself and continue to create the outcomes over and over again. But when we apply it to a living system, we actually think people, you know, the environment, we actually believe this kind of approach degenerates the health of the system. In contrast to that, the living system design is informed by principles. These principles are deeply rooted in the idea of creating flexible frameworks for us to be able to have the freedom to design. And we believe that approach actually regenerates the health of the system. One requires an enormous amount of energy, because in a machine paradigm, you've got to extract to actually keep this machine moving and running. But in a living system, it requires less energy because it can self-regenerate, it can self-maintain. And so when we think of all this, we're always talking about how do we move from the orange to the green as a part of the design process, and that we are supporting those shifts in mindsets, behaviors, and perspectives, and eventually your operations or practices. But that is really the work that's being done as we move from a machine, mechanistic, industrialized approach to one that is a living one that actually honors life and what that means for all of us. So with that in mind, just a little bit insight into some of the principles that we're talking about. The principle of holism. When we are talking about the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So that means we value the entirety of the system and continue to create conditions through a holistic approach that is meaningful and impactful across all of the nested systems, team members, clients, partners. When you think about the environment, that there is no real fence, right? That ecosystems span our national boundaries and that they continue to be recognized as things that allow us to see the expansiveness, the scale, but also how it's all interrelated, which brings us to the interdependence, the inherent, what we call the inherent value of all relationships. We recognize that deep interdependence and that we can't operate in a silo, that all and everything that we do is related to everything else. And so how do we design with that in mind? And to recognize that even though the whole is bigger than all of us, there is this beauty that recognizing the uniqueness of those individuals. So we see that in individual species, when we think about ecosystems or ecology, and you see that when we think about social systems. We're all unique. We all bring something that we think has the potential of incredible genius into these boundaries that we're all creating. Unfortunately, most of those boundaries are not there to bring out your genius, your uniqueness. They're there to cap it. So what can we do to change those dynamics? And then, as we know, and we've been, talked to about this for years in business, where that we need to learn to adapt and to evolve, right? And but that is a dynamic aspect of the balance we're managing within any ecosystem. And our ability to respond to, it's not just planning, it's ability to have a collective regenerative response, and that we can then ongoingly, as a part of the design, have something that is able to adapt and change. And then this idea of nodal, decentralized and distributed, that command and control actually increases the risk of an organization. And that increased risk actually reduces its resilience. So what can we do to redistribute that power and that decision making so that we can have even more ability to be relevant and meaningful in the organizations, in the communities that we're a part of? And then the last is developmental, just this deep belief that, in any ecosystem or a living system, there's this belief that everybody can grow, everybody can continue to have the potential that's beyond where they are currently. And the intention for all of us is to recognize that we want to create conditions for that versus, as we all know, a part is a part is a part. And so if we're just parts in a wheel, ultimately it was designed for one thing and one thing only. And I actually believe that humanity and the social systems that we're a part of have emergent properties that we are no longer designed to benefit from. So what can we do to change that? So Buckminster Fuller, one of the most greatest designers that we know of the 20th century, said this: work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in help. And what can we do to continue to take these kinds of principles? And there are many principles out there that are based in life-centered, in life or living systems. What can we do to begin to be in rhythm with that life versus continuing to be in dissonance. So for us, when we think about that, we also recognize this requires these flexible frameworks. But in understanding that, what we need to recognize is that these flexible frameworks, if not redesigned, create some real challenges. So what happens when you apply these principles, right, that we just talked about to complicated systems, right? So a perfect example is you guys just ordered an IKEA desk. It showed up at your home, and instead of you getting a list of instructions, you actually get the 6 principles I just presented to you and said, now please put this desk together. What do you think your reaction is going to be? How do I put this desk together using principles, right? Right? I mean, but actually what it does is it just creates this incredible frustration. We know it doesn't work that way, right? And the same thing is true when we take what happens when you apply a set of instructions or best practices to complex systems. It's actually frustrating. It doesn't work. And all we're continuing to do is trying to fit it to work. And I think it limits potential, it caps creativity, and it makes you disengaged. It makes me disengaged. What can we do to design differently? So that frustration, we believe, can be displaced with real energy. So we need a new kind of design, and here is the design. We won't have time to get into it today, but it is in real detail. But what I want you to think about this is to recognize when we think about living systems and how we measure them is quite different than what it is in a machine. In a machine, we're clear that a machine paradigm is really measured on 2 things. It's productivity and its efficiency. There's not a single one of us that would want to design a machine to be inefficient or less productive, right? The whole incredible process of the industrialized revolution actually made machines more and more efficient, more and more productive. That's what they were designed to do, right? But now when you think about a living system, what and how can a living system be measured? And what you will probably notice when you look at this framework that really stands out, that's very different from any type of design that will show in an industrialized system, is at the core of a living system is this deep commitment to health, right? The human body does not actually perform well just because you say you want it to run a certain distance or you want it to do certain things. At its core, it needs to be healthy. And we actually have some real examples of when we've tried to create outcomes at the expense of the health of that human body. Let's just use steroids as an example. I grew up in the 80s. I was immensely a part of a lot of sports movements, and steroids were a way to create physical strength. But we began to realize that input actually began to undermine the health of the system, right? I know this from spending a decade plus of my time in the industrialized agriculture. We know how to create increased productivity in crop fields across the world. But then we go and look at what the condition of the soil is after having industrialized it. And guess what? The soil is actually not alive, it's dead. So when you think about an organization, we all know, we've all been in roles, we've been a part of organizations where we have been able to produce incredible outcomes as a society, but they have been at the expense of people. They have been at the expense of the environment. So when we think about design in these flexible frameworks, we think about asking the question, what and how do we design organizations to enable a deep purpose, but not at the expense of the health of the system? How do we increase the energy of that system? How do we increase the intelligent decision-making and the exchange of that intelligence? And how do we create more equity and diversity across that system? Because when you think about those things, that's what makes ecosystems thrive. More diversity, incredible sharing and symbiosis, an ongoing increase in energy because of that photosynthetic process. And how do we do that in a designed organization? Because we say if we can design structures with the purposes of enabling health, enabling the purpose, and creating the conditions for health, then we can do the work that we all want to do. But it's not at the expense of the health of the system. And then the unlimited potential, the organizational resilience, the value and wealth creation across all of these systems can be that abundance that we all want to see in the system. But what we don't want to do is to do it at its expense. So when we think about these flexible frameworks and this living systems design, what we begin to recognize is we again have to begin shifting, right? So all those things I was just talking about, shifts in what we say mindsets, behaviors, and practices, is something that we actively have to begin to recognize. So we have to move from best practices to principles, allowing principles to guide but not prescribe, right? Moving from prescribing to guiding is a part of that process, where they're contextually specific, that bring out the genius in all of us, and that then gets to be seen in a completely different way. And that those prescriptions allow us to move from that to this, what we call responsive frameworks, structures that are flexible and adaptable and responsive to that changing environment. And that we move from this dominance that we know exists in our society today to this deep interdependence, that we need one another. It does not happen in a vacuum. And for any of us to believe that our current success or what is happening in our life is dependent upon just our own work, we're living in a dream world. It is not true. It is heavily reliant upon the lineage of people before us, the lineage of people who will become beyond us, but all of that together allows us to recognize the value in one another. We also want to move from prediction to patterns, right? This is not about predicting. It's about creating the conditions and understanding them so that we can have health and then see what emerges from that. And that emergence is what we've got to move towards. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't some level of planning, right? So I'm not going to tell you that I'm not going to plan for, here are some outcomes we want to see. But I don't want those outcomes to be at the expense of the health of the system, or even more importantly, at the expense of what could be emergent or abundant beyond my expectations or what we could imagine to be true. From extraction to equity, which we've been talking about, people are the energy source of the organization. One of the things that we often talk about is that people will debate me often that the energy source of an organization is money, resources, right? And actually what I continue to help reframe around that is what we have done is we've actually displaced and exchanged these two important things, people and resources, and put them in the wrong positions. So imagine resources are just tools. They're just tools to be able to implement our creativity and the innovation that exists in a system. But people are the energy source. Now, what happens when we switch those? What happens when we see resources as the energy source and people as tools? That's when we begin to recognize that we're extracting at the expense of equity. And that we want to move from this centralized power to decentralized empowerment. The ability to recognize that there is incredible redistribution that needs to happen that can provide some real insight into the creativity and innovation that can exist in organizations. So we have a working definition of the regenerative organization, and it's just a working one. It's a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And so for us, this really is the embodiment of what we want to create when we think about regeneration and a organization that's informed by living systems and the life that we know that exists, is that it's a living and evolving and naturally part of what and who we are, and that should be part of its informed design process. and that the outcomes should just be recurring aspects of the system, just a natural part of what it is. So our approach, that living systems, that deep inclusion of complex systems and social systems, is really a moving away from this mechanistic approach to something that will, we believe, regenerate that autopoiesis, self-maintenance and self-regeneration of that system. That we use principles as a means to be able to create the conditions for that creativity and innovation, and frameworks as a way to provide guidance for that boundary. But it also is a way for us to continue to ask the question of how do we regenerate health as a part of that system. So as a part of us going into our Q&A, I'll end with a famous system scientist, which some of you may know well. The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. However, my words, we treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. We've applied these mechanistic systems to the wrong problems. And what we need to do is begin to rethink, reimagine a different design so that we can truly design in a way that creates health, releases potential, and creates the unique opportunities that we all want to experience in the world we have today. So that is it. So we just want to start this as a part of the questions is, so in light of this information that's been shared today, and some of this you guys know deeply, what's shifted for you? If this is true, if some of what I'm talking about resonates, what does that mean for you? And we'll open it up from there, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Thank you, Trey. Yeah, if anyone wants to respond, feel free to unmute and start the conversation.
Well, this is Toby. I just want to, this is the second time I've heard a little bit about this from you, Trey, and the first time made me see that I wanted to come back for more and really kind of get inside your thinking. And I'm so impressed and grateful and, you know, just really appreciative about how you have made such a strong case for this shift in thinking and are turning it into tangible ways to work with organizations to move through this process. And again, I want to have more of a conversation with you when there's, you know, more time and maybe a glass of wine in our hand and we can be within 7 feet of each other. But about the how the rubber is hitting the road with your organizations. We talked about that a little bit. In terms of what's shifted, the thing that I'm kind of simmering on is, I really hear what you're saying about best practices being prescriptive, which locks things in place, which are necessary if you're creating a machine that you want to push a button and have it go,
right,
but does not work when it's constantly adapting and changing. Something prescriptive is going to, I mean, that's what cancer does, right? And I also know that human beings change their ways and develop themselves through practice. And practice is whether it's meditation or practicing the piano or doing a jump shot or moral and ethical practices. So I'm just like internally sitting with how do we use language and conceptions in a way that people can adopt practices, and maybe that's my bias, but adopt practices in order to shift our paradigms and bring it into our hands and our feet and how we do our work. So love it. Yours or anybody's comments on that. Yeah.
Thank you, Toby. Oh, beautiful comment. And of course, I'm completely grateful for your role in some of my thinking and process here. So thank you. And I will say, we were playing off this kind of industry standard best practices when we were doing that because it's so ingrained in us.
Yeah.
Hey, you just adopt somebody's best practices, it'll all work, versus practices. Because I believe it should be a shift in mindsets, behaviors, and practices. We're going to adopt practices.
Yeah.
It's just, can we move away from them being the practice that all of us should be adopting versus something that can be customized or culturally or contextually meaningful. So, so I completely agree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Love it. Thanks, Toby and Trey. Ezekiel, I see you've had your hand up patiently, so I'm gonna pass the ball over to you. I think you're on mute though. You've got to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I loved and enjoyed every bit of it. Just wanted to mention that, you know, as part of tech, the business school that I work for, we are starting a 3-year research project on regenerative enterprise together with 10 other business schools from throughout Latin America and Spain. So I thought it would be worth pointing it out. And as part of, we're in the early stages of the research. We're just putting down the design of the research, the thing we need to do, et cetera, et cetera. So, and as part of that process, we're talking to many experts on these, people who've been working on this for some time, both on the academic side and on the practitioner side. And when you talk to people, you get two different versions of this idea of regenerative enterprise. The dominant view, I think, when it comes to text, is that this is a paradigmatic change. And I think you're much in line with that view. I mean, we're living behind the Newtonian view whereby nature can be predicted and dominated and made reliable and blah, blah, blah. And then this is a more complex world, and you laid it down very well. So this is one view, and this is a new view on the role between society and the economy, and the enterprise is only the tiniest bit of it, but we should be thinking big. Then on the other hand, you talk to other people, very qualified, very smart, and very prominent as well, and they'll say, this is one more type of enterprise, which requires a special type of entrepreneur, a special type of customer, a special type of investor. It will be more amenable to some industries and businesses, not to others. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because again, I'm coming from the outside, I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, no, great question. Obviously, I think there is a maturation process of regeneration that we are just in the very beginning stages of. I don't think we can just create an immediate situation that allows us to evaluate what regeneration is in an industry or an organization, or even, to be honest, we're still trying to get clear on what that looks like even in ecosystems as a part of a design process. So I think all of our approaches should be from a place or a posture of humility. We're still trying to understand what regeneration looks like. However, what I will say is I can't imagine a system that we would design where it would degenerate the health of the system. So for me, when we think about regeneration at a true sense for us, regeneration in a living system is all about what it looks like to regenerate the health of that system. And so if that is at its core, it opens up all kinds of possibility of what and how we do that. But what I would say is we see examples in ecosystems where when the underlying health is degenerated, species decrease, right? Diversity decreases. And so the question is are we comfortable in continuing to invest in seeing social systems in that same light? And I know that's broader than a enterprise, a business, which we're committed to it beyond just a business enterprise. But I do think it allows us to say that it can't be just niched if that is really its definition. Now, we may disagree on definition, but ultimately, if we're talking about the health of that organizational system, be it a community, a NGO, a business, government, all of that we think should be at its core health. And with that, I don't think it can then be a niche. Thank you.
Such a great question, Ezekiel. Thanks. It's really awesome to learn about the research that you're doing, and would love, please keep us in the loop on that. Would love to, if there's anything we can do to support as well. We've got an interesting question from Andrew Crosby. Andrew, I can read it, or you're welcome to also, unmute. I could call on you if
Thanks.
you want to speak.
Happy to do it. Yeah. Thank you, Trey. I'm just curious, a couple of things, like, thanks for the presentation. It makes sense to me. I guess I just have additional questions, really, which is, first, who's doing this well? And are there any models, like whatever, sociocracy or holacracy, that you think are better or worse than the others? And then my particular concern is, what does the enabling environment look like, the societal enabling environment look like for these kinds of organizations? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Great questions. I think there's some incredible amount of approaches out there that are trying to get at how we create health within that system. I mean, holacracy, sociocracy, reinventing organizations, biomimicry, a lot of different approaches out there that are saying, here are ways of which we can begin to identify and understand what that is. The only thing I will say in terms of what do I see that begins to support that movement versus continues to create challenges around it is when we are using in current systems as a way to implement regeneration that are not adaptable, change, or can evolve. So some of the challenges with some of process and policy that we've put in place, sociocracy and holacracy are perfect examples of that, is it becomes pretty burdensome and heavy on a lot of people as they began to figure out how to do this, right? And I would say that that actually reduces the energy flow in the organization. So what can we do to change that? Me coming from what I didn't share in my background, I actually was a tech entrepreneur, started multiple companies before I got into supporting global restoration of ecosystems, and then into In Rhythm as a part of a social design process. But I have found that, that agile system, and we've used this operating system, actually is forcing people to behave in a way that I'm not sure they were designed in a way that actually brings out the uniqueness of that individual and the creativity and innovation that I think can exist in social systems. And so if that is capped or that is burdensome, I think it puts a substantial amount of capping of the potential in a system. And so those are my just top level thoughts. And I do think that, again, we're early in this process. So we've got a lot of anecdotal information, which I'm sure, Ezekiel, you could probably share too in multiple places around the world as you're doing research of how this is starting to show up. But I think we've got a lot of work to do. But I think health has to be at the center of it. And I think it is something that I think can be transformational if we're willing to ask ourselves that simple question.
Awesome questions and response, Trey. Thank you. We've got a couple more coming in through the chat, and knowing we only have a few minutes left, I'll read them so we can maybe try and get at both. So there's a question from Chris around expanding, on this point of the difference between people as the energy source or money as the energy source. So kind of maybe expanding a little bit on that. And then Kate is pondering how to sustain a regenerative organization in a society/context that is hostile to that philosophy. So the question is, how do regenerative organizations interact/engage with extractive systems?
Sure, great. So great question from both of you. Chris, in terms of, how, well, actually, I'm going to ask Alex, restate that question one more time so I can feel like I can answer it.
Actually, Chris, if you want to unmute and if there's any more clarity you want to provide there, that might help get to the heart of what you were trying to ask. If
And I'll try to keep it quick because I know we don't have a lot of time. Basically, what I heard, and if I want to make sure I heard it correctly, what I heard was this idea that it's either money as the energy or humans as the energy. But if we look at ecosystems, from my perspective, from my understanding, you actually have three components. You've got the resources, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, et cetera, and those cycle. You've got energy, which constantly needs to be pumped in new and fresh from the sun. And then you have the actors, the organisms that use all of that to do stuff. And so I think, like, if I think about Amazon Corp and I think about your average NGO or nonprofit, I don't think Amazon right now could, with all of their financial resources, could crush anybody. And that's not because the people at Amazon are better, it's they have more energy coming from the sun, the money. And so I'm wondering how that fits with how the characterization.
Sure. Yeah, so it's a longer conversation. So I'll go back to what Toby said. This would be a great conversation around a beer or whiskey or wine, all three together, whichever works for all of us. But what I would say is what's problematic of us seeing money as energy versus a tool is it reduces those who are those actors in the ecosystem to something that is extractive. It is impossible for us not to do that. And so unfortunately, what we've got to do is reframe that. And I know that was an example I used, and we can have a longer conversation around it, but I actually don't think the energy is coming from just one source. I think it is bigger than that. But at the same time, what I recognize within social institutions is that if we don't recognize people as actually how we create the outcomes that we all want, we then shift them into they're the means to create the outcomes that few want. And that is problematic from all kinds of reasons. And we see that in ecosystems. We can see how we've used crops as an example to be able to generate fuel at the expense of communities so that we can then do things that we can do differently and not at the expense of those soils. And so so that would be an example of that. But I'd love to have deeper conversation. I know we're getting late on time with 1 minute left. The last question around how do we do this in a society where it's so against this? And I have a deep commitment to supporting a community of practice. We have a deep commitment to that, a community of practice that allows us to be in relationship with people who recognize the need to begin to make this shift. And I think you can begin to have relationships that will shift you as an individual, the relationships that you have as that nested system to communities that you're a part of. And we're seeing that in multiple places around the world. But when you think of it at a macro level, it seems overwhelming. But when you begin to recognize it locally, I think you can begin to influence those relationships and begin to influence those views and begin to see changes, to recognize that the bigger policy changes will still need to happen in the future. But I believe this is an investment beyond my generation, beyond my son's generation. And as a result, that's something that we really are willing to commit to, knowing that it's future generations who will benefit, and we'll see some aspect of that.
This is awesome. Loving all the engagement here, but want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know, we're really grateful you take the time out of your day to join us here live. Again, we'll share the recording. And as Jen said in the chat, we would love to continue the conversation. If you're curious, if you want to have further conversations, if you want to get together for whiskey, wine, and or beer, we would love to do that. So please feel free to send us an email and we'll be getting in touch with you with the recording and also some other ways to connect with us and engage with us if you're interested in diving a little deeper. So Again, you have our emails. Love to hear from you and look forward to connecting hopefully again in the future. Thanks for joining. We'll see you all soon. Take care and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks very much.